First of all, let me thank you for the welcoming us here and for the opportunity to record this interview. At the present time, we are witnessing new economic wars that do not promote the development of integration, the development of countries such as Russia, South Africa, India, Brazil and China. Developed countries impose sanctions and additional measures in order to consolidate their privileged position. What is the role of BRICS in this situation? What is the role of cooperation in the BRICS in this regard?
Thank you for the opportunity to be interviewed by you, and welcome to South Africa. You know, BRICS is a very important multilateral organization, but in many ways it represents more than just the 5 countries. It also represents the regions in which those countries are located. In the case of South Africa, we see ourselves as representing the region of Africa, or the continent of Africa, and certainly the sub-Saharan region. I make this point because the world, BRICS represents about 40% of the world population and about 25% of the GDP of the world. Therefore, the majority of the people in the world, you know, live in the BRICS countries, yet the majority of those people in these countries remain at very low prosperity, of low income, and that's why we call them developing countries. So I think it is very unfair that there are sanctions against the BRICS countries by developed countries, because it doesn't help the case of developing nations. And in a world today where it's a globalized world, you actually need people to work with each other. And of course, there may be very many reasons for sanctions against countries that are part of BRICS, but it does not mean that that is the right approach to solving the problems.
You say that our countries, although they weren't the sources of the third industrial revolution, may be successful in the fourth industrial revolution. How is this possible?
Well, as a very good example, let us take Africa, which I guess I would suggest an expert on, because I'm located on the continent. And our businesses are located in about 40 African countries. So it is fair to say that the first, second and third industrial revolution bypassed Africa. And here we're talking about industrialization. We're talking about the computer revolution, digitalization of the African economies. So of course, Africa has not had industrialization to the extent that the developed countries have. And part of the reason for this is that most of the African resources was in fact taken out of Africa to, in particular, Europe or the colonial powers. So Africa did not have the resources to develop itself, and Africa was colonized. And the whole purpose of colonization was to keep the people in Africa under subjugation and to therefore use them as labor. That meant it was not in the colonizers' interest to industrialize the African economy. We face a situation today where, with the fourth industrial revolution, you can bypass industrialization. In many respects, you don't have the legacy problem, ironically, of industrialization. A very simple example, Africa had the least fixed telephone lines of any continent. And many African countries did not have going into the rural and poorer urban communities, including South Africa, by the way. With the advent of mobile technology, it was much easier to get Africans to be connected. Today, Africa has now got lots of bandwidth coming into the continent. The reason why I make this point that Africa can grab the opportunity better than any other continent is that it's got the most young people under the age of 35 in the world today. And more than 50% of the African population, and by 2030, that's going to be something like 65%. Now, young people are the key towards a digitalized economy. And so if we're able to skill up young people on the African continent in particular, and we can teach them things such as data analytics, computer science, all these kinds of things, or skills that are necessary for the fourth industrial revolution, then we'll see a situation that Africa can, at the very least, be on an equal footing to other countries. So it's not that Africa necessarily will take the lead on the fourth industrial revolution. I don't think that's possible in the foreseeable future because of the fact that we do require a high level of industrialization, because each revolution, industrial revolution, is built on a foundation. It's not in isolation of each other. But what the fourth industrial revolution does do is, for developing countries within Africa and developing countries in other regions of the world, it gives them the opportunity to utilize young people and technology in order to enable them to participate in the globalized economy.
At the last summit, you strongly supported the idea of developing women's and youth entrepreneurship. Is this a tribute to fashion, or do you really see this as a new opportunity for your country and for other countries?
Women are very central to our daily lives as either our partners or mothers, our daughters, grandmothers, etc. And frankly speaking, unless biology has changed, all men come from women. So at the very basic level, we should recognize that women are central to our development and our core as humanity. But at a very professional level, women make up more than 50% of the global population, and women have equal rights to be at the leadership level. And in my experience, certainly, women apply themselves well and are incredibly intelligent and are great scientists, academics, business people. And why should they not be given an opportunity to be part of a leadership structure within the BRICS Business Council and within BRICS itself? For that reason, we really supported, in particular, the Russian position by Anna Nesterova, who put forward the idea of a BRICS Women's Alliance or Club. And I'm not quite sure what it's going to end up being called, but we unequivocally support that, because women must play a central role in multilateral organizations and, frankly speaking, in leadership positions. And it's time that men stop acting selfishly and take away this glass ceiling that they put in front of women. And it's important that women be able to realize their potential to participate equally and in leadership positions. I, in fact, have made the point to the South African BRICS Business Council that I personally would like to see myself replaced by a woman. And I hope that the President and the government listens to my suggestion, that I think it will be quite iconic for a woman to lead one of the 5 BRICS Business Council.
Obviously, the desire of South Africa to become a bridge to the whole continent for all other African countries, from Europe, from the BRICS countries, in addition to natural resources and such young residents, what other resources and opportunities do you offer to African, Russian, and Indian partners?
I think it's an important question in relation to the size of South Africa. Since South Africa is such a small country in relation to the other larger BRICS countries, is it able to play a leadership role? So I guess there are a number of ways in which we can respond to that question. The first is that South Africa itself does not see itself alone as participating in BRICS. It has always maintained that it is representing the African continent and sort of 50-odd African countries. In many ways, that is a symbolic statement. South Africa tries to act as a bridge between itself and other African countries. But I think there's another point that needs to be made, and that is that size does not always matter. And we can look at the example, for instance, of Singapore. Singapore was not long time ago an island city with hardly anything, lots and lots of poverty. And through great leadership of the Singaporean people and its government, it was able to make it one of the most successful city countries in the world today. With a port, I think 40% of the Southeast Asian, 40% of the port traffic went through via Singapore, a highly technology economy, and the living standard of Singaporeans, it is the envy of the world today. So there is a very good example where, where you've got a country or a city that is tiny, that was able to actually have a huge impact. So I don't think that South Africa is any different. Africa's time is now. Second Jala, the company that I chair and founded, it means it is so, or the time is now. It was the famous slogan used by Nelson Mandela during the 1994 elections, the first liberation elections in our country, when Mandela became the president, where he said to the South African people, the time is now, second Jalo Kinako. The time is now for us to lead, for us to unite, and for us to build a better countries. We see our role as South Africa as a long-term one. This is very important. I think those who try and find solutions within a few years are really barking up the wrong tree. And we have to be realistic about it. And that's why I often say to people when they say, well, what has BRICS achieved? And I point out that BRICS has only been around for a short space of time. South Africa only joined BRICS, I think it was in 2010. In 2013, we started the BRICS Business Council. So in order to measure the success of a multilateral institution such as BRICS, we have to take a time span of 50 years. We cannot take a time span of 10 years even. It's much too short. We have to sit down and build the relationship. We have to court each other in order to be able to build a common understanding. We all agree we have a common understanding of the future. What binds us as BRICS countries is the noble objective of trying to make the lives of our people better. It's not good to have poor, suffering people, whether they're in the Russian hinterland or the Chinese rural areas or the African or South African rural areas or the Brazilian slums or whatever it is. We must work together to making sure that those people have a much better life, have what the Chinese like to call moderate prosperity. And we have a right to aim for that. And so what do we mean by moderate prosperity? We mean at the very basic level, a right to houses, education, healthcare, aspirations for their children to have a better life than them, and then to have a comfortable existence, to be able to have decent working conditions, to be able to contribute to the development of their own country. And I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think if the world tries to deny the majority of the world's population, if developed countries are selfish in the way they approach the world, whether it is through sanctions or whether it is through trade wars or whether it is through undermining the economies of developing nations, it is not good for the world. That is why I personally am involved in BRICS, and I've taken the position of the chairmanship of the BRICS Business Council, because I believe in these noble objectives. I believe that somewhere along the line, maybe not in my lifetime even, maybe after I'm gone from this earth, the BRICS countries will have set the policies in place, including the regions in which they're operating, to make sure that the peoples in those countries and regions have a much better life, certainly much better than the last 50 years going forward.
From your dialogues at the BRICS summits, you can see that you have already formed informal, good relationships with colleagues, chairmen of national parts of business councils. Is it possible to communicate in an informal situation, maybe outside the BRICS Business Councils?
We tend to see our relationship as the chairman of the 5 BRICS countries in a duality. On the one hand, we have a very formal relationship because we have to lead our councils of our respective countries, and in this case, I also have to lead the 5 And so we have a duty, which is to make sure that we prepare the working group reports and to make sure that we prepare the annual reports, to make sure that we are able to present these to the 5 presidents at the summit, as well as, of course, participate with the 5 presidents at the BRICS Business Forum. That is our official duties. I don't think I can tell you what we do unofficially because it might be banned on television. On a more serious note, what we do socialize, yes, of course. The 5 chairpersons, we do know each other well now, and most of us have been there since inception of the BRICS Business Council. And we do tend to talk about matters of interest, and occasionally we have a bit of a drink together. Sometimes we have a bit of a party together, a dinner together. One of the great pluses or outcomes of having been involved in BRICS is the very warm relationship that we have had with the other council members. I know Mr. Shazhik Katrin from Russia, for instance, if he's in the BRICS meeting, he's a very formal man, but if he's at a dinner, he's a very different man. So, and I think it's intended to achieve is to try and just not have formal relationships, but to warm up the personal, interpersonal engagement between the various participants.
Are you preparing any surprises for the upcoming summit for your colleagues, or is it too early to speak about it yet?
No, we have a few surprises, but I will tell you 1 or 2 that we're going to do. We're going to dare each of them to swim with the sharks in Durban, and in the open waters, and we're also going to invite the TV BRICS crew to join us.
If you please, a few words not about BRICS. Africa is developing rapidly, including our industry, the media business. What are the main trends for media business in South Africa now, particularly for television? How is it developing?
Well, media in South Africa in particular is a very sensitive and difficult topic. And we have to track it. Let's firstly speak about traditional media. By that we mean print and television and radio. Now, traditional media has been, during the apartheid years, was owned by the white minority population and the businesses. And so until recently, until about 5 years ago, that was still the case. So the media was still owned largely by the same people that owned it during the old apartheid years. And if I can give you an analogy, it is like saying that after the Russian Revolution, the media in Russia should still be owned by the Tsar and not by the people themselves. So we had a situation where we acquired one of the big media houses, and it was not well accepted by the other media houses because they were together for 40 years, including supporting the apartheid government at the time. And so we, in a way, disrupted the traditional media because the economy is still largely driven by white people that also control the media, because apartheid prevented black people, like myself, for instance, from participating in the economy. It was legislated to deny black people from going to universities, participating in the economy, etc. And so for that reason, we have a strange situation, a contradictory situation, that politically in South Africa today, it is a black majority government that is in control. But economically and the media, with the exception of perhaps a few media entities, are still very much controlled by, the old establishment, who are by and large a reactionary establishment, who are not in favor of BRICS and who are not in favor of progressive economic development and social justice, because their roots come from the old right-wing apartheid era. So second is that media is in a very difficult space. Although people continue to read the print media, it's not what you call the sustainable in the long run. Even television is now changing with OTT, and even radio is beginning to change. But it does not mean it does not occupy the media space. In fact, that's one of the biggest myths of the world today. So the myth is that social media occupies the space of traditional media. That is not true. All the statistics show that if you're talking about news, for instance, on social media, that news in 80% of cases is in fact driven by traditional media. Although the myth is that lots of smaller websites and others like that actually make up the new media space. That is not true. And the reason for that is because traditional media has the financial resources historically to invest in the new site. Traditional media versus the new media. The reality is that traditional media is still very much in control even of the new media space, although it doesn't appear so. So for example, you may have 100 or 1,000 websites, but they would still not have the reach in the States, for example, of the New York Times, just as a very good example of that. If you rank the news media sites in most countries, you'll find that most of those media sites come out of either newspapers or television or radio. So the irony is that as much as people like us to believe that the new media space or the social media space is completely independent and completely separate from traditional media, the reality is not so. And one can unpack the reasons for that. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, but those exceptions are few and far between. Secondly, to be able to compete with the likes of traditional media, you would need to be able to have very deep pockets. So in South Africa, if you take the news sites that are there on the news websites, the first 5 news websites in South Africa are all owned by traditional media. And that makes up 80% of the news sites. Then if you take foreign-owned sites, for instance, such as MSN or similar kind of sites, they then make up the remainder. So smaller websites have no chance, even though you'd often come across people and they'd say, we are starting our own website. Now, one of the things I often find amusing is that people say, well, you can tweet anything. That is true, you can tweet anything. But most people tweet the articles that appear on the websites owned by traditional media houses. You don't realize it. Of course, you tweet what you want to tweet, but still at the end of the day, you are tweeting the links that are set up for you by traditional media houses. If the majority of the media houses are controlled by the same people that controlled them over the last few decades, it means that social media itself is controlled by them. One of the other things to bear in mind is that a big element of social media is paid for social media. Now, the public doesn't know this, so the public thinks when they're getting news which is just generally coming to them at a random way. It's not the case. Media houses tend to pay social media, and that is why people like Facebook and Google and similar social media organizations or companies make so much profits, because they're being paid for. So it's a vicious cycle. Traditional media is losing steam. In order for it to retain its readership, it has to pay the social media giants such as Facebook and Google in order for people to read. The question implied, of course, is always, is there a change in the media landscape in South Africa or for the world? My answer is emphatically no. Apparently, it looks like there's a change, but there's no real change. The reality is that traditional media still today control, and that's why the fight for traditional media is so powerful, because it's not a fight for profits. This is what people forget. It's not about, you're not going to fight to own a television company or a print company or radio company for the profits that it's made. If you want to have profits, you'd rather invest in other industries. You're fighting because of the influence that those companies have over the population. Because if you own those companies, you own a sizable chunk of the social media where most of the population resides today. So what has simply happened is that younger people don't read newspapers anymore, but they do read the same articles that appear on websites in social media. The myth that they don't read is not true. The only difference is that the tool which they're using to read the articles is no longer the print format, or they don't watch television. They watch it on social media, but it's the same content. Traditional media has simply extended its tentacles to now have social media as part of its ecosystem. That's all that's happened in the world today. What does that actually mean? It means that those who control traditional media continue to control the news flow in the world today. Whether that's good or bad is not what I'm commenting on. You can make your own conclusion from that.
The population of BRICS countries is 40% of the television audience, the internet audience. Are there any universal themes that will be equally interesting in all countries?
Yes, I think BRICS countries have a common base. The first is that they're all developing countries. Whilst the GDP of China may be, as a country, the second biggest in the world today, and some would argue it's even bigger than the US, if you take into account purchasing power parity, the reality is the Chinese per capita GDP remains still very low. Similarly in Russia, similarly in Brazil, and India, of course, and South Africa. And so what is common amongst these countries is that the Gini coefficient, the gap between the rich and the poor, is in fact still very, very significant, right? But these are developing countries. For many decades and centuries, they were hamstrung by either colonial powers or by rich countries that were able to subjugate them and their populations, if not colonize, certainly restrict them from growing their economies. It is a fact that through industrialization, the West was able to dominate the last 400 years of the world today. And they used that domination in order to enrich themselves, at the cost. So one of the greatest trades in the world, even bigger than gold, was the slave trade. And if you look at where the slaves came from, they did not come from Europe, and America. The slaves came from Africa and from South America and from Southeast Asia. And it was more valuable to trade a slave. In fact, many great universities of the world, such as Brown University in the US, was actually founded by one of the wealthiest men in the United States, who was a slave trader. So Africa's people were taken away, South America's people were taken away, Southeast Asia's people were taken away. And so not just the people were taken away, but the good resources were taken away. The cattle in Africa, South Africa for instance, when the colonizers came here, we had indigenous people, the Khoisan community, the Xhosa population, that had the most flourishing farms with cattle and lots of greenery and, self-sustaining. All of this was taken away from them brutally by the colonizers. And so the land was taken away. So, and if you do not have land, you cannot produce. So developing people in the BRICS countries have experienced that through colonization and through subjugation by powerful interests in the world, in particular the West, that's what we share. We share that common history of our lives and over centuries having been disrupted. And through that, of course, emerged common struggles against oppression, struggles against colonization, struggles to seek democracy and peace and freedom in these lands. Maybe it's different economic systems, political systems, but we have those values. Those are the fundamental values that we have. We seek to use our leadership amongst ourselves as the BRIC countries to be able to right the wrongs of the past and to give our people the opportunities to now have economic and social progress, which was denied to our people over the centuries. And so the formation of the BRICS is for us to be able to share our economic resources, to be able to share our technological resources, to be able to increase trade between our countries and our regions. Our objective is not to fight the West. Our objective is not to fight anyone else. Our objective is simply to say, listen, we are there to look after the interest of our people who have a right to a decent life in all of our countries. So if you ask me what binds us as the BRICS countries and the leadership of these countries, it is this really very sincere objective. We can no longer allow, poverty strips the dignity of a person. It is not right that because you are born into a rich family, you should be entitled to wealth and a positive future. And if you're born because of the lottery of life in a poor family, you are forever destined to be, poor. The world should not work that way. If you work incredibly hard, you should be given the opportunity and right to improve your life and to improve your lot and to get out of poverty. So I think that what I also like about the BRICS countries is that there's an element of not being selfish. People in the BRICS countries recognize it's not about the countries themselves. It's not about the leadership only of these countries. It is about the people, and it's about doing something to ensure. So that is what unites us as a people. And 40% of the world's population has to come out of the developing status into a moderate prosperity status.
If you were in my position and could interview the presidents of Russia and South Africa during the summit, what question would you ask them?
That's a very difficult one. Well, I guess that I'd like to ask them, how can we strengthen, first of all, the bilateral relations between Russia for Africa, and how can we make sure that we have a united position in the face of bullies in the world. We should not allow our people to be bullied. We have a sovereign right to exist, all of us. We have a sovereign right to our identity and our aspirations. We should not allow that to happen. So, and I think one of the other questions is, how do we further the economic links between our countries? Simple things that could make a difference is removing, all visas between the citizens of our countries, removing barriers to trade between our countries, increasing tourism between our countries, setting up multilateral. One of the key objectives must be to set up BRICS institutes, physical institutes as well, not just virtual ones, in each of the BRICS countries, centers of excellence. I mean, I think the fact that you've started TV BRICS is wonderful because it's an important step towards showing what is happening in the BRICS countries.
And the last question, if you please, is a personal one. You are a famous businessman, political and public figure. Is there anything that still surprises you in the modern world?
I can never understand why people are so selfish. The world can be so much a better place if everyone is just prepared to share a little bit. You don't have to give away everything that you have, but if you give away just a little bit, you could make everybody much more happier, much better living conditions. It's something which I've always grappled with my entire life. As a young boy, I've never hesitated to, if I have an apple, I would divide it in half and give half to someone else that hasn't got an apple. If I have a cool drink, I would always share it with someone. If I have $1, I would share that. And I never understand why people are selfish. So I don't understand how they don't see that there are people that have nothing in this world. And I try and use my own personal resources, wealth, if you like, and influence to be able to encourage people to see other people as human beings. And it's not just a question of poverty. It's also a question of culture. People that speak differently are no different to you. People of a different color are no different to you. People of a different religion are no different to you. And so we're all one humanity. Why can't we care more for other people in this world today? And why can't we be less selfish? So I guess if we can achieve that, you don't have to do it in a big way. You don't have to stand on a stadium and shout out these things. You don't have to have big organizations doing it. It's just in your everyday life, in the way you conduct yourself and what you do and how you engage with people. I think if you're able to set that kind of example, then the world becomes a better place. And so I really would like to see that that kind of world. I'd like to see the world change. It doesn't matter if you're Russian or South African or African or if you're Chinese. It shouldn't matter at all. What should matter if you're a person that does good deeds, it's simply how much good you do in the world. And not good that you advertise to others, but good simply that in your everyday life, that you can make incremental changes to the lives of other people. I think if we can do that, then I will stop being surprised. I will no longer be upset. What upsets me are not politicians. Politicians come and go. Politicians love power. Politicians love money. Politicians like to have influence. What upsets me is when ordinary people don't recognize the value of other ordinary people in the world today. The world can be a very cruel place today if you have no power, no resources, very, very little money to exist. The world can be a very, very cruel place. And we should not allow that in the world today. We need to get back that humanity.
Thank you for the interview.
Thank you very much.